So welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Diana Conway. I am president of the Montgomery County Women's Democratic Club, and I want to thank you for joining us and welcome you. We have a terrific program for you today, and we're excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Fiona Hill. Before we begin, I have the usual couple of announcements. First, word about WDC. We are all about getting organized and getting results. So we do this by keeping you, our members and friends, informed on key issues affecting women and their families, and then enabling you to take action with WDC and our sister organizations. The goals are to promote democratic policies and elect Democrats who prioritize the well-being of women and their families. And that means educating and advocating for effective and equitable laws and policies for a healthy and resilient community. We work to hold elected officials accountable and appointed officials for pursuing our priority concerns. So at this event, you've heard me ask before, but I hope you will consider joining or renewing your membership with WDC. Your membership and participation are what give WDC the standing to weigh in on critical issues, and we hope you'll consider being part of the community. The link will be going into the chat at the bottom of your screen for your convenience. And your membership also gives you a vote in our WDC leadership elections, which are coming up at the end of June for our next 2-year cycle of the elected executive committee. And here's your teaser. At our June meeting, Jamie Raskin has agreed to be our keynote speaker. So stay tuned for that, and we hope that'll help you decide to become a member or to renew. We also have a number of hardworking committees and committee chairs, and so we urge you to join one of the committees, get active, make it fun for yourself, bring a friend along, and as always, give us your suggestions and your feedback on how we're doing and what we could be doing better. And we have regular mostly weekly updates with a ton of community calendars listing town halls and democratic breakfasts with various speakers, and links to our countywide Democratic Central Committee, which maintains a terrific calendar as well. Their calendar includes paid events. Ours is limited strictly to free events like town halls. So enough about us. First, a word about our next program. Just a heads up that on May 31st, we'll be welcoming Congressman John Sarbanes and his fabulous For the People Act. HR1 S1, the numbering system tells you how important it is to both houses, and proposes sweeping measures to expand the franchise, inject transparency into election funding, reduce the influence of money in politics, limit partisan gerrymandering, and create new ethics laws for federal office holders. In true WDC fashion, we have a number of tools for you to get involved and help us out. Our sister groups, Silver Spring Progressive Action and Do the Most Good, as well as Common Cause, are all running phone banks. And the idea is you call the constituents of the senators who are standing in the way of getting this through the Senate. It's already passed the House, as you probably know. So any of those three groups, in addition, Do the Most Good is hosting a May 8th John Lewis Day of Action for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And on May 8th, they'll be at the Silver Spring Farmers Market registering voters and giving them information on the three key pillars that we're working on. One is the For the People Act that John Sarbanes has introduced. One is the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. And the third one is the DC Statehood Bill. So that's May 8th, and that's through Do the Most Good. You can find everything you need on their Facebook page. And I have not seen any word about elected officials. So I'm going to skip that. We hope some of them will join us. And your final reminder is that you're muted, but we do want your questions. So please put them down in the Q&A. You're welcome to put anything you'd like in the chat, but if you want the questions to wind up on my screen, please put them into the Q&A. And if you, this is being recorded along with all of our about the last year of programs. So if you've got a friend who needs to watch this, or you have to leave early, you can catch the rest of the program. And now on to today's program. Our format today is going to be a little bit different. We're going to skip the formal presentation and go straight with the more conversational model with Dr. Hill. So let me introduce Dr. Hill. Dr. Fiona Hill catapulted to national prominence with her riveting testimony in the first Trump impeachment trial, where she demonstrated her deep understanding of Russian-American relations. Equally important, she exuded integrity, courage, and love of country. At the time, she was serving on the National Security Council, and Dr. Hill had worked previously for the National Intelligence Council, the Eurasia Foundation, and Harvard's Kennedy School. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and currently at Brookings. Dr. Hill has written extensively on Russia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, regional conflicts, energy, and strategic issues. Her several books include Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, and the Siberian Curse, How Communist Planners Left Russia Out in the Cold. Dr. Hill earned her master's degree from Harvard University and another from Scotland's St. Andrews University, and a doctorate from Harvard. Based on her decades-long exploration of authoritarian regimes, Dr. Hill recently characterized the January 6th Capitol attack as an attempted self-coup from Trump. Her newest book is There's Nothing for You Here, Opportunity in an Age of Decline, and that's due out in September 2021. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fiona Hill. Dr. Hill, thank you so much for making time for us. We know you're hard at work on another book and look forward to that, but let's jump right in. So can you start by sketching out a little for people your background, how you wound up in the US at the highest levels of government and national security?
Yes, certainly. And thank you so much, everyone, for having me today. And Donna, it's really great to be here with you and everybody else from the committee. And I'm trying to sort of look across the entire grid. It's wonderful to see so many people, even if we are all trapped in our little boxes on the Zoom screen. But it's nice. I sort of feel like I'm, with you in some fashion, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to all meet in person. So I started off in studying Russian really as a result of the times in which I was growing up. And, I'm looking around here on the screen and, I don't want to be prying into people's ages, but I do see a few people here who'll probably remember the same time frame as I do. In the early 1980s, we had a war scare between the Soviet Union and the United States over the stationing of missiles in Europe. It was the SS-20 and Pershing missile crisis, known as the Euro missile crisis, a bit of a kind of a rerun of what happened with the Cuban missile crisis, so they're much further away from the United States. And I was a teenager then in high school, and we were kind of basically between late 1970s and early 1980s. Every year there seemed to be some kind of scare that there might be on the brink of nuclear war, and that got particularly bad in 1983, 1984, which was the year I was finishing up high school and thinking about what I was going to go and do at university. And against that backdrop, I decided to go and study Russian. And I had actually a cousin, an older cousin, who was in the campaign for nuclear disarmament, the actually anti-nuclear movement in the United States. She was the mayor of one of the local towns, and a great uncle who had been in the convoys during World War II, supplying the Soviet Union at the height of the war. The convoys that went through the Arctic, Canadians, the United States and the UK and others were all part of this. And so we'd gone from, in his mind, having a wartime alliance with the Soviet Union at the peak of World War II to then, rapidly moving into the Cold War and being on this brink of a nuclear exchange. And both this cousin and my great uncle Charlie encouraged me to study Russian and see if I could figure it all out. Which is one of these kinds of things. You're a teenager, you think naively, yeah, sure, maybe I could do that. Which is a bit strange because I was growing up in a coal mining town in the north of England, but everybody was very active and engaged, like people are here, in this committee. And I thought, well, why not? Nobody ever told me I couldn't do this. So, I set off and decided to go and study Russian at university in 1984. And then by the weird confluence of timing, I just was in the right place at the right time. Because I went to university in that year of 1984. I went there against the backdrop of the miners' strike, which was a big deal for my family. My dad had been a coal miner, and there was just all this upheaval. A year or so in, we had Chernobyl, and we're on the anniversary of this. Right now, the 35th anniversary. I'm trying to reduce my age here by fantasizing I'm younger. The 35th anniversary of Chernobyl, and here I was studying Russian, and obviously the Soviet Union was in big trouble. And in 1987, I got a scholarship from the British government to spend a year in Moscow. And I was there during the Gorbachev-Reagan summits. And it was the signing of the INF Treaty, ending, in fact, this whole standoff over ballistic missiles in Europe. And I was there for that happening and saw Reagan come for the Moscow summit in the summer of 1988. Got a job as a stringer for NBC News. My accent at the time was a bit impenetrable, coming from the northeast of England. So they put me on making things like coffee and running around for Maria Shriver, the great Democrat, and running around with a camera crew, doing everything from spraying Tom Brockhaw's hair as he stood on the top of this Hotel de Rossier of the Kremlin, giving the nightly news, his hair blowing around in the wind, and I was the person who was responsible for keeping it in place like a helmet. And also with the camera crews going around taking pictures of Russians playing baseball or basketball or other things that, you know, would be a human interest story. And in the course of that, I met an American professor who basically told me about scholarships to the United States. So everything was about timing, about mentorship, you know, interventions from older colleagues, relatives, you know, telling me about various opportunities that were out there. I applied for a scholarship, ended up at Harvard in 1989, collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War, and everything kind of led me in a strange, what seems like now inexorable fashion, but wasn't at all, lots of twists and turns on the way, to ending up, you know, becoming a Russia expert and being able to actually focus on these whole issues. It started off after, you know, meetings with my great uncle in the street on a shopping day on a Saturday, with you know, the older, you know, relatives all going back and forth about how the heck do we get into this mess. So, you know, bizarrely enough, I ended up in the administration as the senior director for Russia and Europe, or Europe and Russia, at the White House, just as we were withdrawing from the INF Treaty. So I start off over the war scare and end up actually in the administration as we're pulling out of the very treaty that I'd, you know, spent so much time thinking about in my earlier period. So there's a strange circularity to all of this as well. I'm sure many people on this Zoom call have things like this happening in their life, but I would never quite have anticipated it.
That's to go from spraying Tom Brokaw's hair. I hesitate to ask whether you ever saw the same thing happening for our recent president.
Yeah, lots of hairspray there too, I suspect. But fortunately, I was not wielding the can.
Good. They're flammable, I'm told. So I need to quickly recognize Delegate Charlotte Crutchfield has joined us, who's been a real leader on criminal justice reform in our state legislature, and Nancy Kopp, who is our state treasurer. And also, I'm told Marcy Frosch is out here. Marcy is one of our longtime members, as well as married to our favorite Attorney General, Brian Frosch. Well, okay, so first question, I guess, is what's going on with Ukraine and suddenly Putin pulling back his troops and letting Navalny have access to a doctor after being so tough? Is he just trying to keep everyone off balance? Is he not knowing what he wants to do himself? Did somebody get to him with some kind of effective threat?
No, he's keeping everyone off balance. And, you know, the most dangerous time is when someone pulls back in that way. And Putin, you know, particularly likes to get everybody riled up, get everyone extremely concerned about things, then pull back. And, you know, then he can basically assess his options. How did people react? Does he have to kind of send another message? And while we're all kind of looking over here, you know, in terms of troop movements, he might be doing something else over there, like a cyber attack, or sending in sort of proxy forces, or doing something else to destabilize the situation. But, you know, kind of what he's really trying to do is make us let our guard down and kind of go, phew, gosh, thank goodness, you know, kind of we'll all sort of sit back in our chair and think, wow, you know, the fear that we had. It's like those war scares of the 1980s, to be honest. And, you know, we also run the same kind of risks, though, of this getting out of hand. Because in the 1980s, you know, we were doing the stationing of missiles rather than, you know, the moving around of men, little green men's, you know, the Russians have been terming them these proxy forces or paramilitary forces that they've been using, or assassination squads and other people that they've been sending out to do terrible things to people. And, you know, we also then had a series of massive military exercises, both the US and the Soviet Union did in the 80s. And now a lot of that material is declassified. The archival material is out there because, you know, so much time has elapsed, and we can see that there was a mutual misunderstanding of what was going on. So the war scare was real, but then, you know, everyone sort of backed off a little bit. And then they did find a way of having Gorbachev and Reagan engage in these arms control negotiations that actually did find some solution for stabilizing the relationship and taking the heat out of the confrontation. I fear that that's not what's going to happen here, unfortunately, because Navalny is part of the mix here, as you're suggesting. Because I do think that Putin's running scared of Alexei Navalny, and the appeal that he's had in terms of being able to whip people up into protest. And at the time when Navalny was targeted for assassination by the bizarre thing of putting a rare and unprohibited nerve agent in his underpants. I mean, you couldn't really make that one up, could you? And that's a kind of a hallmark of Vladimir Putin, because he's, a black ops guy. He's the kind of person who rose up through the back corridors, the dark corridors of power, doing unpleasant things like this, the clandestine hit, the subversive action. Why did they want to take him out at that particular point? Because Putin was passing through amendments through the Russian parliament and upper houses to the constitution that would enable him theoretically to stay in power out until 2036. So a full 36 years from when he started off in 2000. And that's partly because there's a great debate going on about who succeeds Putin. He's kind of taken everybody else out of the picture. He's become the only person who matters. And then the problem is he becomes a wild card. What if he dies? What if he has an accident? What if he gets sick? He's been hiding away, trying not to get COVID for, the best part of the last year. And then, if he is then to be the determinant factor, the person who decides everything, is he going to have a successor? Who's that going to be? And he was actually scheduled to leave office in 2024, which is kind of coming up fairly quickly. And I think then you might have suggested or be able to think about, succession crisis, people moving around and thinking, well, I'd like to be president next, or, putting a lot of pressure on who is he going to choose? And then he would become a lame duck. So I think part of this whole process we saw this past year in 2020 was to take the uncertainty out of the situation by saying, okay, Vladimir Putin will theoretically be here until 2036, but it adds to the uncertainty because, can he continue to be the vital power, the person who can call all the shots? And here is someone like Alexei Navalny saying, no, actually, absolutely not. We want to have a say, we younger generation, we don't want to have this kleptocratic clique at the top of power indefinitely. And, we're not asking for revolution, but we're asking for change, political change. And Navalny was getting traction. And at the same time, in Belarus next door, Alexander Lukashenko had been in power since 1994 and was trying to stay on even longer. And, basically there's massive protests against him. There were other protests out in Siberia and the Russian Far East in Khabarovsk when the Kremlin tried to put their own guy in the local government. And so there's all of this trouble starts to happen against the backdrop of COVID. And I think Putin starts to get scared because the longer you stay in power, the more vulnerable you become to protests or to things that you can't always control. And I think Ukraine is part of that too, because Putin has to show that people like Zelensky, who got into power because of a grassroots movement and organization, like basically Navalny, can't really succeed. And so we see all of this happening because Putin is insecure about his own future and about the future of the system he's created.
It's so interesting to hear you say, because of course, from the sort of the lay perspective out here of reading papers, it seems like he's just, and I know this is the intended projection, but it just seems so brash and self-created. And I mean, I feel like in many ways Trump was unpredictable, but Putin seems to be unpredictable by intent rather than just by random inclination of the moment.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, he's calculated, unpredictable, and as a result, it becomes predictable because, this is all kind of part of the pattern to keep us on our toes.
Right. Let me quickly mention, we also have from Tacoma Park, Cindy DiBella, City Councilwoman, and Eden Durbin is here representing Delegate Jared Solomon from District 18. So thank you guys for joining us. So getting back to Ukraine, and can you talk about the hearing where you became famous and you had Burke Braithen making cartoons of you and sending them to you? And specifically, did you, well, other than teaching us how to pronounce Kyiv, did you really think that that the Senate might convict? Did you have hopes that, and if not, was there something that in retrospect you would have done differently, or a different set of facts that might have pushed the ball more successfully? What's your take sort of in retrospect?
Well, I mean, I'm afraid that my take in retrospect is the same as it was in real time, that this was, really a partisan struggle. And that for many of the members of Congress, not all of them, but this was more of a game, a political game. And I'll just give you a few examples of this. So the first part of this, after I was subpoenaed, And there was never going to be any question in my mind that I was going to go and, stand up and tell what I knew, because I believe very firmly in representative democracy and in oversight. Although I'm not a political person myself, I really believe that our democracy depends on every branch of government doing its own job, myself included, and having, come in as a professional into the executive branch and having served before as well in government, that, we must, submit ourselves to basically scrutiny and oversight by Congress. And I testified to Congress many times before, and including also when I was at Brookings institution as a, kind of a civilian fact witness. So, the role of a fact witness is very important. But what I saw, right away at the initial phase in the closed door depositions, which took part in October, was just a whole bunch of gamesmanship. Now, I did see, Congress men and women behaving admirably and doing their jobs, but let's just say I saw an awful lot, particularly, some of those on some of the committees, just playing this out as a game. So one person who's been in the headlines, recently, Matt Gates, for example, he came in at the beginning of my deposition hearing. He wasn't on the committee. And he basically sort of took the whole room by storm and, sort of sat down and, is basically, accusing everything of being a witch hunt, show trial. I think I know a show trial when I see one. I've studied plenty in the Soviet case. This was, hardly a sort of a secret hearing. The media was all over the place. And, proceeds to hold the whole thing up for best part of an hour. Much later, he figured out how to do it more effectively and held up my colleague Laura Cooper from the Pentagon for something like 5 or 6 hours. But basically in watching him and how he behaved, it was a complete game. Because after he engaged with me in a staring contest for a while, and, I'm a good 20 years older than he is. I've also been in middle school, we've all experienced mean girls and mean boys. And, I just thought, come on, what is this? This is just ridiculous. And so I just stared back, and then he picks up the newspapers at the end of the table, Politico, The Hill. And then, he kind of starts to engage poor Congressman Jamie Raskin in discussion of the best places to go out and eat in Chevy Chase, which is just as if, Jamie Raskin is in charge of the Michelin Guide or something. And it was just like bizarre. And I sort of sat there for a whole hour watching all this and thought, well, this is ridiculous. And what happened was it got me really angry because I thought, I'm here to do my duty. I took an oath to the Constitution. I presume he did too when he was sworn in as a member of Congress. And, he and others are just, basically trivializing this. And so it was already, I'm afraid, the pattern set. There was a lot of note passing. There was a lot of kind of, behind the scenes people trying to flush me out to name the whistleblower, for example, and there are, of course, whistleblower provisions and protections. And then there were, all kinds of just sort of grandstanding. And then there was the falsehoods, the false narratives about Ukraine. And so I already determined, from the October deposition and, all 400 and God knows how many pages of it now have been made public, that this was not going to go well. So I think, the only chance of it going to go well was if every member of Congress took their duty and their constitutional oath seriously and decided that this was not just some kind of partisan game, but was actually something that was for the benefit of the United States, the Constitution, and, for the greater good. And there were not sufficient people, I'm afraid, who were basically doing this. Now, obviously, it was kind of a bit stronger on the Republican ledger, but I did see some, gamesmanship, going on elsewhere as well. I think, of course, the tragedy, was when this went to the Senate because, the Congress, had proper hearings. And in the Senate, there was obviously already a prejudging of what was going to happen. So I don't think that anything I did or would have done would have made a difference. I do personally wish, of course, that Ambassador Bolton had testified. And I think he was expecting, in fact, to be able to testify to the Senate, but he got outmaneuvered.
And how did he get outmaneuvered? Because I remember everybody wondering why his book came out afterwards.
Well, yes, but I think that, he already, was planning on saying the things that were in his book. But, they outmaneuvered him by leaking material from the book ahead of time so that people would know what was in it. And I think that was the kind of decisive factor for some of the Republican senators who were interested perhaps in hearing him then to decide not to. And by that time, I think the whole thing had already been prefigured and prejudged. I mean, when we have, members of our Senate saying, well, we're not going to do anything other than what the White House asks, then, we're in, some real problems. And look, I was already aware of the risks of this, because a lot of people want to know, well, why did I go in there in the first place? I went in there to try to tackle what the Russians had done in 2016. And because, I know so much about Vladimir Putin, I was already national intelligence officer. I felt it was my duty to do something when I was asked, and I was aware that this could be problematic. And, let's just say I was a little naive about how bad the domestic partisan politics were, or just the gamesmanship and the personal agendas of people. And, I got a crash course in that. And, I'm afraid we're just as dirty as the Kremlin at times. So I'm delighted to know that your next speaker is on getting finance out of our politics, because that's precisely the problem that I saw in action.
Exactly. Yes. And so actually part of my pitch at the closing is to make sure that everybody watching actually does something to really welcome our next speaker, which would be to help get the bill through the Senate. And
that's crucial, because that's when we do get into Kremlin territory. And, and what I saw as a result of, the whole 2 years, that I was there, and also in the course of preparing and, reading around and, listening to everyone's depositions and, the hearings, is it's the influence, the pernicious influence of money. Because who are the actors who were able to, for example, get Masha Yovanovitch sacked? They were all, kind of business cronies and colleagues of people like Giuliani and others. And I saw over and over again, bad actors in our own sphere who were all just motivated by money and who don't really belong to any political party, but who were, basically given a platform by the porous nature of our political system.
Sounds very much.
Sorry, I sound a bit preachy there, but it was something that, it's a national security threat to all of us, a national security threat.
Yes, and it sounds exactly like as though you'd be talking about President Trump, who doesn't really care about party, but is in it for the money and winds up posing a national security threat, an existential.
Correct. I saw no ideological compass for him, actually, not just a moral compass, but no ideology. He's not a Republican. He's not a conservative. It was just rank opportunism, as far as I could see. Not the case of everybody around, but that's kind of, in that instance, is what I observed.
Functional selfishness, yes. Let's go back to Ukraine for a moment. I know Ukraine has been asking for a while to get into the EU, and they were turned away once. And I gather the president was recently back visiting in France and Germany, asking again to be let in. And I guess because of the mutual defense concerns of NATO and as well as the EU, I think they've said no or they're going to say no, which sort of leaves them out in the cold. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I mean, this is a dilemma that we have overall right now in the European security space and political space. I mean, Ukraine ought to be embraced as part of that kind of broader sense of political, geopolitical, and economic Europe, there's no doubt. It's the problem of the way that the institutions are set up. Because, I'm sure many people are aware here, particularly with Brexit, that there's always been a lot of debate about whether the European Union should be more political, more like a United States of Europe, or it should be a looser, trade and, kind of customs organization and more focused on economic issues. And Britain was very much in the camp that it should be more economic, more kind of, mutual trade, and was not very keen at all on the political side. And those tensions eventually, erupted. It's the same with some of the other European countries. And also there's a lot of tensions with some of the countries that have joined through the extension of European Union. Poland and Hungary, come obviously to mind. That there's been, quite a lot of political backsliding, especially in Hungary and also, regrettably in Poland as well. And that the Poles and the Hungarians again in particular, game the economic aspects of the European Union. So they'll block lots of political action, but they'll take advantage of the economic side, the subsidies and, the kind of structural payments that get transferred across the European Union, of course, getting the backs up of everyone else. And there's an awful lot of fear then of bringing Ukraine in as a result of that. There was, of course, a serious effort to have an association agreement with Ukraine and also with Armenia and Georgia and another set of other countries. And that's when the Russians started to act and push back and then, take the action that we saw, because that's seen by Russia as a backdoor to NATO, as you're suggesting, Adele, because of the sort of mutual security arrangements. The EU does, in fact, coordinate with NATO. And this is, of course, Russia's big fear is of a more robust, a more extensive NATO, which brings the military alliance, ever closer to, Russia's borders. in Ukraine. And, I think that this is actually part of why we saw that buildup, because Zelensky was talking again about trying to get a closer relationship with NATO, membership action plan. The Georgians have been doing the same, and they, of course, got invaded by Russia in 2008. And they were also talking about having naval exercises in the Black Sea, because when the Russians seized and annexed Crimea, the Ukrainians also lost their Black Sea port. They'd leased some of it out to Russia, but that was the home base also of the Ukrainian Black Sea fleet. And the Russians, of course, just annexed half the Ukrainian fleet, taking half their ships and some of their sailors as well, who they kind of, compelled in many respects to declare allegiance to Russia and sort of switch citizenship. So this is all kind of a bit of a mess.
Well, so
and I was going to say that the Black Sea is a particular flashpoint as well that we should be paying attention to.
So to me, that brings up the question: if they're not going to let in countries that create problems or create potential problems like Ukraine, should they be expelling places like Turkey or Poland or Hungary?
Well, there's a lot of questions about that, and I'm glad you raised Turkey. Turkey is obviously not in the European Union, but it is in NATO. And Turkey has done a lot of things of late, including the purchase of S-400 missile systems, anti-missile systems, which were actually intended because the Turks are so paranoid that we, the United States, had something to do with the coup that was perpetrated against Erdogan back in 2016. That those missile systems were intended to bring down American fighter planes, which are part of the Turkish Air Force as well. And then, of course, Turkey has been a pretty bad actor across the board on all kinds of things. Taking hostage of Americans, including Pastor Andrew Brunson, our local employees in our embassy, all kinds of things that are really very problematic and troubling. And of course, the EU-Turkish relationship is very strained too. I think in the case of Turkey, Russia's been seeing Turkey as a kind of a prize. So kicking or expelling Turkey out for NATO is what Putin wants. He'd like to see NATO, have a, Turk exit, a bit like Brexit from the EU, and see it weakened. So, what I think it's really incumbent is to kind of put the Poles and the Hungarians in particular on notice about, and in fact, the EU has started to do that, to impose penalties on them. So they can't kind of draw indefinitely out of all the funds if they're not going to actually stick to the political plan. And it's the same kind of thing now. Erdogan could get away with a lot with Trump in place because there was a sort of a bromance there too. And, honestly, I was more worried at times about Turkey than I was about Russia, because I had Turkey and all of Europe under my portfolio, because Erdogan was extraordinarily good at manipulating the situation. We couldn't be the gatekeepers to keep Erdogan at bay from making phone calls to the president and just kind of catching him at all times, like on the golf course, but we could with Russia. It was actually easier to, stop, Putin from calling, the hotline of the White House, but very difficult to get Erdogan to do that. So Turkey was an absolute bit of a disaster of a relationship. And now that Trump is out of the picture, Erdogan has discovered in the recent genocide resolution announcement, on Armenian genocide, underscores that Turkey has lost its caucus, it's lost its support within the American body politic, and Erdogan is now on notice.
So this ties into a number of questions that have been coming in. On one hand, what is the best explanation for Putin's control over Trump, or Trump's deference to Putin? And then the related question is, did you ever see Vice President Pence ever push back or object or try to redirect from one crazy idea to a less crazy idea?
Yeah, these are all great questions. So, first of all, I want to emphasize that President Trump would never do anything for anybody. So he was not under the thrall or the control of Putin. He would only do things for himself. But what we're seeing, and this is why I spoke out not just during the testimony, but I wrote that piece about the self-coup, is someone who thinks very similarly. They were, in a way, acting in parallel, if not in concert, because Trump is also an adherent to the authoritarian's playbook, and I saw that over and over again. He was creating a hyper-personalized, not just a personalized, quasi, personality cult, you might call it as well, but system. He's declared the Republican Party his party, even, including out of office, bucking all kind of normal conventions. But he was very much focused on keeping himself in power. and also winning the presidency in the first instance during the campaign, and obviously that result being, kind of quite willing to take whatever information was out there. As far as Putin is concerned, you might want to describe it more as a bromance. He said to Bob Woodward, in a kind of shockingly candid exchange that we now, hear in the tapes, but I'd heard him say things like this before, that he's more attracted to the strong men. There aren't many strong women out there. He did admire Angela Merkel. This is in his mind. Angela Merkel, until she kind of lost her traction in the elections. And I heard him say many times that she was, kind of something else. And then, she started losing elections. Doesn't like, the idea of losing. So it wasn't, because she was a woman, but because she was seen to be a winner and having power as the Iron Chancellor, in the German context, and having German heritage, she was well aware of that. He also was quite obsessed with the Queen, who is not an authoritarian and is a constitutional monarch and doesn't actually have a lot of power, but she has a lot of status. And she has a lot of stature and she has a lot of respect. And he was pretty obsessed with her. And he was extremely deferential to the Queen in ways that he wasn't really to others. And again, that was in my portfolio. I saw that as well. So I just want to put this in context. So for him, it was all about status. And it was about what that person signified. And it was a sort of bit about reflected glory. So it wasn't that he didn't really have a peer group of a very small one. There would be she in the same way. It wasn't about China, because, you saw him taking extraordinary strong action against China, and Putin, it wasn't really about Russia. It was about Putin and what he stands for. Powerful guy, unassailed, constitutional powers that Trump himself didn't have. And, basically people fearing him, not just respecting him. And also in Trump's mind, possibly the richest person on the planet, and Alexei Navalny's video suggesting, yes, kind of, pretty much up there. So somebody who could pretty much do what they want. President Xi, similarly, having got rid of all the sort of term limit equivalent in China, the Queen, Erdogan, who Trump often called the Sultan, kind of as a sort of a sense, but would goad him because he thought actually the power was greater on his side, which he was right, than with Erdogan. But the two of them would, kind of stand off and do, the kind of chest bumping against each other. Viktor Orban, because he had, sort of similar status within Hungary. Bibi Netanyahu, Trump saw him as another strong man and, somebody who was, pretty much in control of Israel. So there was a group of, and then the kings, the Saudi Arabia and, kind of others, for example.
So there's nothing really to the theory that you know of. There's nothing to the theory that somebody had a secret tape on him or some kind of secret.
We all have tapes on Trump. I mean,
Right.
It's not just, my point was anybody could manipulate him. All you had to do was send a flattering Twitter feed, praise him. He had a nasty list of people who he didn't like because they'd said nasty things about him. And, part of our job in the NSC was to keep track, and sometimes we failed, of nasty things people had said about him. And on the other side of the ledger, when somebody said something really nice about him, they were his best friend. And that's why he was tweeting, all kinds of, regular American citizens who said something nice. That's, the kind of way to get influence. So there were several times when, for example, Putin would deliberately, it was so obvious, it was glaringly obvious, would have a press conference, which would be kind of picked up on, the US media, and he'd say something flattering about Trump, and then Trump would want to call him.
So I'm happy to say that our crack team just put into the chat the link for your article about January 6th. So I hope people will read that while we wait for your book in September. Can you talk a little bit about Afghanistan, whether you think pulling out was the right thing to do, what's going to happen next, and specifically something that's always concerned me, this sort of the left behind theory that all these people on the ground who help us, who risk their lives, their family, everything, to help American troops or our allies, and then are promised aid either to get out or to go somewhere, some kind of support or protection, and then don't get it and we leave.
Yeah, it's how we leave. And, obviously most of the conceptualization about American intervention always involves boots on the ground and a military intervention. But, we know that that's not the only way in which the United States can intervene. We've been extraordinarily good in the past at our humanitarian interventions and at working with countries on their longer term development. What we've obviously failed in Afghanistan is to really kind of, basically definitively create a secure environment, and we're not the only ones. I mean, the Soviet Union did the same in the 1980s, and of course we contributed to their departure with our support for the Mujahideen. But, you know, kind of the tendency always in Afghanistan has been people leave, they go off, they kind of lick their wounds, and, you know, the whole thing kind of starts over again, the cycle. So it's how we leave. How do we conceive of the ongoing relationship with Afghanistan? Do we work with all of the other neighbors? Because Afghanistan doesn't exist on the moon, it has neighbors. And, you know, part, I think, of, you know, the desire to try to find some stabilization and diminish the confrontation with Iran as a key neighbor of Afghanistan is critical, with China, you know, not just Russia, the Soviet Union, the Central Asian states, Pakistan, India. You know, we have to work very closely together with a whole host of other countries, the Koreans, the Japanese, there are many here, and our NATO allies who've been part of this with us, to try to figure out whether we can have a long-term perspective for Afghanistan that's not just about boots on the ground. Now, obviously, we're reading in the paper all the time about still the great fears for the future of the Afghan military, of the policing, of, you know, the government extending itself outside of Kabul. So this is clearly going to be a very difficult effort. But it's also, you know, I think it's been a lesson to us in 20 years that we can't do this alone. And we can't just do it, you know, through military means. So, you know, I think it's not, okay, we're taking the military effort out, but we can't leave. Right. And I think that we have a responsibility, you know, to be part of a larger effort to at least try to, you know, keep Afghanistan stable as much as we can. It's not keep it stable, but try to find a way of stabilizing Afghanistan and protect the gains for women and other minority groups and disadvantaged groups that we've helped to promote over, you know, this last 20 years.
I grew up in the Foreign Service, mostly in third world countries, and the presence of USAID was always overwhelming. Running schools, running food programs, running medical clinics, Voice of America. And I think all those things have been drastically downscaled.
Yeah, but again, which is why we need to do it with others as well. And we have to, because look, it's a security risk for all the neighboring countries too. And that's, you know, it's a long-term effort.
Do you think it was the right thing for Biden to say, okay, troops out?
Well, you know, I'm very conflicted about it. I mean, I think, you know, for all of us watching the forever wars, you know, going on, personally, I wouldn't have gone in the first instance, you know, but that's kind of as a, you know, a student of history. And I'm not just saying that now, I actually said it at the time, but, you know, I didn't work on Afghanistan, but I had looked at the Soviet experience. And then there's the infamous British experience in the retreat from Kabul. Although, you know, kind of after that, Britain was more involved in development. And there have been periods in Afghanistan where it's been more decentralized. And you're probably aware of that too, from, you know, your own knowledge from the, you know, the Foreign Service, where there was a kind of something of an unstable equilibrium between Kabul and the regions, and there was more development. And that was a period when Turkey was actually involved, and India and, you know, other, you know, kind of countries in that effort as well. So we have to kind of figure out whether we can bring something like that to this issue.
I guess that brings the broader question of nation building as a mission, and it sort of comes and goes as a vogue. Isolationism versus nation building intervention. And do you think, I mean, is the globe slowly making moral progress toward diplomacy rather than weapons, or is it simply going to become cyber war versus hot war?
Well, unfortunately, I think we've already got cyber war, you know, rather than hot war, with hot war remaining behind that as the ultimate threat. This is actually what we've seen with China and with Russia in particular. And this is, you know, the SolarWinds hack, the hack of our election in 2016, the efforts in 2018 and 2020. Russia wants to be a cyber power. What it would like to do is retain influence and be able to sort of threaten us by reducing the risk of a conventional military exchange, and, you know, heaven forbid, a nuclear exchange, although they'll certainly rattle the nuclear missile, tactical nuclear missile, or, you know, even strategic at times as well, with a bit of nuclear blackmail to remind us. But, you know, I think that our adversaries like China and Russia certainly see cyber as the new frontier in space as well. So it's these different domains here. So we're already there, unfortunately, in that regard. So how do we try to work to contain that and to try to get that progress that we're all hoping, you know, for? Well, this is where we really do have to get back to working with our allies and with other countries. Now, I also do believe that also begins at home, and that's actually the theme of my book, is about the opportunity crisis. I've actually made the the subtitle a little bit more positive, because I wrote this with the, oh my God, we're completely screwed with 4 more years of President Trump in mind when I started writing it, because it came out of my testimony when I said that the United States had given me opportunities that I would never have got at home. And then as I walked away from the testimony in a table, I thought, yes, but not for everyone else. Not for everyone. I came in the United States in 1989, and since then, opportunities have disappeared for so many people. And, we need to we have an opportunity crisis, and this is why we've got a polarized politics. And what I mean by opportunities, all those barriers to getting ahead, race and gender, place, the spatial inequality we have in the United States, class, there is still socioeconomic class. It's more evident in the UK sense, but it's still here in the United States, and all the other constraints that we have on people's socioeconomic mobility. And so the subtitle is now on finding opportunity in the 21st century. And Biden has talked about what kind of foreign policy can we have for the American middle class? And that's the kind of secret that, I think that we have to look at. Can we work on creating a foreign policy or sort of shared perspective with our allies that benefits everyone, not just someone or some group? And that's kind of what we're talking about in the case of Afghanistan, right? So that women are not, or minorities like the Hazars and others are not basically just persecuted at all times. And how can we, within our own society, show the way? And I'd like to see us try to tackle that on a transatlantic level with, the UK, with France and Germany and others. But how can we think about this across the board?
Brexit. You mentioned Brexit earlier, and we were talking about the interactions through Europe with some of its less well-behaved members. How do you see that affecting the ability of Europe as a whole and in interacting with the US if we try to stabilize regions, or we try to hold up a wall around the Soviets, the Russians, or the Chinese expansion?
Well, Brexit is a bit of a disaster. Again, it was also built on a lie. And also it came out of the result of, it was very similar to what happened in the United States in 2016 in terms of, people with long-standing grievances, but basically all kind of pent-up anger going to the ballot box. Now, there were a lot of other people who voted for Brexit among the Conservative Party and, kind of larger groups of people who kind of believed that the EU was holding Britain back. But where I came from in the north of England, my hometown voted 61% for Brexit because they believed that the propaganda that Brussels was, taking away resources, tax revenues that were, kind of then being spent in Bulgaria, or Brussels, and not being, spent in Birmingham or, kind of my hometown of Bishop Auckland, for example. And, people wanted to get Brexit done so that the government would start paying attention to them. So it was very similar to the kind of phenomenon that we had in 2016 of people feeling like they were being left behind and no one was paying attention to them. And, Britain's demography is a bit different. So, we don't really have the same kind of racial diversity in parts of, the Britain that, kind of felt kind of left behind. But these are all the old coal mining and steel mine areas where they lost every single bit of their industry in the 1980s. So when I left school in 1984, high school, only 10% of kids had a job. 90% of British youth had no jobs and were looking for something immediately after leaving school. And I was one of the lucky ones because I had a place at university, 90%. And Britain wasn't very diverse at this point. So, the kind of racial dimensions that, we have to address here in the United States, actually we have to address now in Britain, 30 plus years on, were not really present there. But a lot of these places remained homogenous. I don't want to say we remain white because people thought of themselves as Scots, Irish, English, Welsh, and traveller. And my great grandmother was a traveller. So a hawker, the most, kind of put upon minority in the United Kingdom. So people there felt very underprivileged and disadvantaged, class-based, geographically based. Mm-hmm. And nothing changed for them. Nothing, not a thing for 50 years. And then someone comes along and asks them, how about leaving the EU? Because the EU is actually causing all of your problems. And actually, in fact, it's the government and government's policies in Westminster. And so they vote yes. And so, and they vote very differently from all the people in the South and elsewhere, who are voting on all kinds of other, kind of bases as well. So there was a populist, very strong populist element to Brexit based on a lie, that had nothing to do with the other, kind of points of this. But now what we have is a result of people being hoodwinked into, voting for this, which is not in their best interest at all. is that now we've got Britain and the UK, the EU, basically pitted against each other. Disaster in Northern Ireland. You can see violence, breaking out all over again when the troubles have been resolved in the framework of the EU. And it makes it much more difficult for the United States now. Now, is that impossible to resolve? No, I don't think it is. And I think it will be by trying to address this whole idea of a middle class or working class foreign policy. So I think we could actually work with the UK and in Europe, because this movement of the yellow vest, the gilets jaunes in France, is a very similar phenomenon. All the people from these kind of benighted, forgotten, hollowed out communities in rural France who feel extraordinarily angry, with Paris, with the disparities. Also, in Germany and elsewhere, the people who feel left behind in somewhere by the knowledge economy, deindustrialization, or the hollowing out of rural communities, they're all looking for the same kind of thing. And so I think if we have a more sophisticated discussion about this and start to factor that in, it actually might make it somewhat easier. And I think, Joe Biden, right, I've been very impressed by what he said so far. If he could give that, some adaptation of the State of the Union speech for a kind of, broader European endeavor to get rid of all of our barriers and, kind of our constraints on opportunity, we could get.
So I guess that was my next question is, do you see, his model seems to be there's a huge role for government, especially now after it's been sliced back so hard that all the communities were left standing when the economy left you behind. Is that model being recognized and discussed for replication in the major European democracies?
Well, I think it's starting to be. The Germans, although they're going to have this major, shift with Angela Merkel leaving the chancellery, they, I think, are a bit lost at the moment while they do that, changeover. Macron was trying to do that in France. He had these town halls, you might remember after the Yellow Vest movement when he went around the country. Has he implemented it? Not so much, but, he's also gunning for re-election. But in the UK, despite all of the drama around COVID and the Boris Johnson in 2019, did what Trump did in 2016. He broke the, equivalent of the blue wall, the red wall, because, the Labour Party, strongholds. In 2019, again, on this idea of getting Brexit done, basically a lie to people in, kind of many of these regions. But now he wants to keep the votes. And so he's got this agenda called leveling up, where, he's kind of talking about how to bring some of government and government facilities into, and in the UK, it's not remote. It's not like moving the FDA to Iowa, thousands of miles. You're just moving a few hundred miles. So the passport offices moved to my home area of Durham, for example. They're talking about moving the House of Lords. It's interesting. I don't think they're going to enjoy that too much, but anyway, kind of maybe to York or something and a few other places. But these are not big distances. So then that will force infrastructure changes, because all the infrastructure in the United Kingdom basically joins together, a kind of a small area between Oxford, Cambridge, and London, and then a couple of big cities, and everybody else, you may as well live on Mars. Good luck, trying to get from one town to the next. And of course, in the United States, we have that in a huge area, of vast distances problem. But you can see that in Britain, they're thinking along the same lines. And the Scandinavian countries have already done that. They've already thought about this. And, there are other countries in Europe that have been thinking about this too. I think we could use that as the basis for a new transatlantic agenda. It's kind of what we did after World War II when we were trying to reconstruct Europe with the Marshall Plan. That was just a transfer of wealth. But in this case, something more purposeful, and where we could swap, best practices, for example. Some things that work on a British level would work on a regional level in the UK. You can drop the United Kingdom into Texas, 10 times or something. So you're not going to be able to wholesale do a model on a kind of a tiny distance scale. But, it's a sizable population, 68 million people. You could start to see whether that might be adaptable, for example, in, kind of discrete United States as regions. And I think the European Union could help too, because the European Union, when it brings a country in, makes them go through a whole host of political and economic reforms. Now, you can backslide once you get in, but those reforms are extraordinarily interesting because the whole idea is of leveling up. It's improving their democracy. And of course, then they have to be held account like the Poles and the Hungarians when they move back. But it also is helping them to lift up their regions. And one of the problems that I think that the Brits wanted to leave, and certainly from my area, is that, they're still living with incredibly high rates of poverty. And, so the average income in my hometown is the same as Puerto Rico. So it's nowhere near the UK national average, which is much below what it is in the United States, but it's nowhere near, any kind of comparable US state either. I mean, it's kind of, around some of the poorest counties in Louisiana and Mississippi, but a kind of average of Puerto Rico. And, we know how much assistance Puerto Rico needs. Right. And so, people in places like this in the north of England or parts of Wales and others are going, why is all this money going to Brussels and going to, kind of level up parts of Bulgaria and Poland when we're not leveled up? Right. So that's, and then there's boroughs of London, which are very diverse, a lot of immigration, that London only has 45% of its population under this, kind of term of white British. And again, I would just want to say white British only appeared in 2011 census, and it includes Scots, Irish, Welsh, English, and traveller, Roma gypsies and Irish travellers. So, this is the, kind of Britain's having a hard time coming to terms with all of its kind of demographic shifts as well. Right. But it also is kind of feeling like there's a lot of parts of Britain need fixing, so, but the EU knows how to do this. So the EU could have, developed its regional and structural fund programs further and not kind of cut off the, the supposed, main countries of France and the UK and Germany when they have so much regional disparity. And it's something I think with our American relief program, that we could start to think of as well. I mean, I'm very heartened. That's why I changed my subtitle by some of the things that, Biden is suggesting, because all the things that in my research, because I've looked at this in Russia and in other countries of Eastern Europe about what we need to be doing. We need to bring home the same kinds of development perspectives that probably, Diana, you were looking at when, your family were in the Foreign Service, back home to the United States and back to, some of our more advanced countries in Europe.
So a quick change of category. We're running out of time, but a lot of questions about what it was like to be a woman in those upper echelons. And did you have mentors? Were there some ridiculous stories like there were no bathrooms for you? Or, I mean, any moments like that came along? Any lessons learned along the way?
Well, there were certainly a lot of ridiculous stories, that we might remember one where it was leaked out to the Washington Post that President Trump thought I was the secretary, but he pretty much thought everybody was the secretary, including many of the men. So that was, kind of part of the problem. And I never really recovered from that, but nobody ever did anyway. I often look back to that was like in my couple of first weeks there. I thought, well, what if that had played out differently? But he would have listened to me anyway, because he didn't really listen to anyone. I didn't get any kind of sexism and misogyny from, the people I worked with immediately, but very much so in, the kind of the Trump White House. There was a dress code, which is pretty obvious. And after a while, I felt that I was sort of standing out in my kind of normal, professional, dowdy woman look. And I felt like I had to, kind of go out and buy a few kind of brighter colored dresses so I wouldn't be mistaken for the secretary, but I wasn't going to go and, have the radical Fox News anchor makeover. And, if you watch Bombshell, that was kind of like the sort of feeling that you had when you walked over into the White House. I'd go over from the, completely professional, total normally feeling part of the old executive building, go over there and take a deep breath, and try to kind of hope I could pass through without kind of, standing out for looking fairly normal. It was like a different species seemed to inhabit the other part of the West Wing. The Ursula von der Leyen dilemma of not having a chair or a sofa, right. Common, totally common, but I've developed over the years a very thick skin to this. I am actually telling some of these stories in my book, by the way.
I can't wait.
Because the misogyny is rife, and there were all kinds of things that I witnessed, and you might remember from the testimony. Ambassador Sondland, accusing me of being upset when I was actually angry with him. The whole thing that, women can't get angry or irritated or frustrated in the way that, men can, because, then, it's some kind of...
You're hysterical.
Yes, you're hysterical. Or you're raising your voice when you're just sort of talking firmly. My 14-year-old daughter does that to me too. And I said, just you wait until you're an adult woman. And, you're accused of screaming when you're actually just being as firm as daddy is.
Well, yes, so you've taught her well, so congratulations. We have to cut out, but we're really looking forward to your book, and we'd love to have you come back and tell us the next chapter. And we look forward to watching your career go forward. It looks like you've got big plans and hopefully more books in the works. So thank you again, Dr. Hill, for making
thank you. And just a big shout out to you and all of your members and the people who've come in. I mean, there's so much important work that everyone's doing here too. And one thing that I'm actually extraordinarily grateful to the first impeachment trial was to get to know my Congressman Jamie Raskin. Has become a personal hero of mine. I mean, I'm sure of many people here too.
You're in good company.
So that was kind of one of the bright spots in an otherwise, kind of unpleasant first set of encounters with people. I thought, my goodness, this is my congressman.
Yes, yes,
I was quite delighted, and honored to meet him.
Everybody's got a wonderful story, at least one to tell about Jamie, and they continue to roll.
Yeah,
so maybe you'll come to our annual meeting in June and hear from him again. So thank you again.
Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you. Us. I'm going to just
make honor. Thank you.
Quickly, so a couple of closing remarks because we're over time. That was tremendous, and so I hope you guys will come on March 31st to hear from Congressman John Sarbanes to talk about his act, which I think we just heard Dr. Hill tell us she liked very much. So you can also send this recording to any of your friends by going to our WDC YouTube channel. I hope you'll sign up for the 31st. I hope you'll help us welcome Mr. Sarbanes by getting involved with the Do the Most Good phone banks and the Silver Spring Progressive Action phone banks, and also the May 8th Day of Action that Do the Most Good is running, and you can find that on their Facebook page. So thank you all again for joining us and the great questions. I hope you will consider joining WDC or renewing your membership, and don't forget to let us know how you think we're doing. So stay safe and hopeful and engaged, and thanks for joining us today, everybody. Bye.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you, everybody. This was great.
Thank you.
Great job.
Terrific.
Could have gone another hour.
Easily. Dr. Hill was terrific. Thank you.
Fun part of this job.
Great job, Diana.
Thank you. Nice job setting it up. Persistence.
I can't believe she remembered me because I don't remember. I don't even remember the event.
Oh, that's too funny. Yeah. Well, that's what makes her good at her job, I'm sure. So hello out there, everybody, and I hope you'll consider signing up for the May 31st event. The sign up is not yet up, but it should be up shortly. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you, as always, to our WDC Zoom host, Scott Weber, and the Q&A queen, Mary Lou Fox.